Welcome. Today we are going to address the first chapter out of Philosophical Fragments by Johannes Climacus, aka Soren Kierkegaard's pseudonym Johannes Climacus, edited by S. Kierkegaard, aka Soren Kierkegaard, although, technically not, and all sorts of fun, different reasons as we addressed earlier. Just starts off with the idea of this is a thought project. Even has a little preposition at the very beginning, right? The question is asked by one who, in his ignorance, does not even know what provided the occasion for his questioning in this way. We're starting off with this idea of we're asking a question, but we don't even know why we're asking this question. And this kind of then goes with that title, right? It's a thought project. We're thinking about it. I don't know why we're thinking about it, but we're thinking about it. And that's kind of the very beginning of his discussion. In other words, something popped into your head and you're like, okay, well, let me tease this out. Let me try to be intellectually honest and address this in this way. Also, the title of the section here of the chapter, the Thought Project, could very well lead us to enter into that sort of debate that exists with Kant, Hume, Descartes, Bonaventure, and many others that we'll talk about as the course of this semester goes by. In other words, what's the value of thought? How do we think? What's the process with it? But as we read the first line under section A here on page 9, can the truth be learned? The very first line out of this text tells us that we're not really debating what Kant says right away. Right? That this question, can the truth be learned, directly goes straight back to our readings that we had the very first week of class, intentionally, right? That of Meno, where Plato is engaged in this same sort of conversation with Socrates and Meno and a slave boy on that whole question of, can the truth be learned? And so Socrates very clearly, as a quick surmise, right, says no, that you can't learn the truth. You can't learn things, and this is definitely Plato's conviction as well, against others, right, Antisthenes and those who will kind of challenge Plato on this. But for Socrates here, the idea is that no, right, you either know it or it's not. And in fact, the next line, in case you weren't quite sure, kind of explains this, right? With this question we shall begin. It was a Socratic question, or became that way, of the Socratic question whether virtue can be taught. For virtue, in turn, was defined as insight, knowledge, truth, etc. See several different works, including Meno, in there. And so far as the truth is to be learned, it, of course, must be assumed not to be, consequently, because it is to be learned, it is sought. Here we encounter the difficulty that Socrates calls attention to in the Meno as this sort of proposition. A person cannot possibly seek what he knows, and just as impossibly, he cannot seek what he does not know. For what he knows he cannot seek, since he knows it, and what he does not know he cannot seek, because after all, he does not even know what he is supposed to seek. Right? There's this very basic question that we had engaged earlier on. I can't teach you something you already know because you already know it, and therefore I'm not teaching you. I might be reminding you of a facet of your knowledge, but I'm not teaching it to you. I'm not introducing it to your knowledge because it's already possessed by you. Furthermore, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know how you're not going to know it. Therefore, I can't tell you, especially if we have this sort of worldview of the eternal return and the cyclical universe where you've had your opportunity to learn it before, and therefore you don't get it. Right? Socrates thinks, continuing on, through the difficulty by means of this principle, that all learning and seeking are but recollecting. Right? You're just remembering, you're recalling something that you had already experienced or have knowledge of. Thus, the ignorant person merely needs to be reminded in order by himself to call to mind what he knows. The truth is not introduced into him, but was in him. Right? Go ahead and underline that sort of line there, right? That the truth is not introduced into him, but was in him. This is the Socratic position. Socrates elaborates on this idea. And in the Greek pathos, it is in fact concentrated. Right? This becomes the idea, the worldview wrapped up in it. Since it becomes a demonstration for the immortality of the soul, retrogressively, please note, or demonstratively in the pre-existence of the soul, right? We have all of these sorts of ideas in this pre-existent soul that's attached with this. Again, a worldview that's not shared by the majority of us, but was kind of held as an assumption for Socrates, or at least as Plato is demonstrating for Socrates. Kierkegaard, Climacus, and I'll be going back and forth just out of ease on this, but you all know where we're at with it, right? Kind of summarizes a little bit more throughout page 10 that Socrates is a sort of midwife to knowledge. He's there, he's not giving birth to it, but he's helping you recollect something that's intrinsically already in you. And so this is the sort of idea that he's presenting himself with. Moving on to page 11. Viewed Socratically, any point in departure in time is eo ipso something accidental, a vanishing point, an occasion, right? Anytime we move from this event in time. Nor is the teacher anything more if he gives of himself and his erudication in any way. He does not give, but takes away. Then he is not even the other's friend, much less his teacher. This is the profundity of Socratic thinking. This, his noble, thoroughgoing humanity, which does not exhaustively and conceitedly cultivate the company of brilliant minds, but feels just as kin to a tanner, and for that reason he soon became convicted that the study of nature is not man's concern, and therefore began to philosophize about the ethical in the workshops and the marketplace. But philosophized just as the absolutely with whomever he spoke. Right? So again, we have this sort of interesting debate here. Socrates really doesn't teach anybody. You can't do all of that. And we're not really looking at everything or just the brilliance of some groups, but all sorts of intelligence have their different values in different places. And so Socrates can go ahead and talk about philosophy in the marketplace and turn his attention to notions of ethics instead of just trying to understand how we got here, which is another valid question, right? He continues about 2/3 of the way down on page 11. In the Socratic view, every human being is himself the midpoint, and the whole world focuses only on him because his self-knowledge is God knowledge. Moreover, this is how Socrates understood himself, and in his view, this is how every human being must understand himself, and by virtue of that understanding, he must understand his relation to the single individual always with equal humility and equal pride. Right? For Socrates, we're all in this sort of midpoint, right? We'll have notions of eternal return that we've been here pre-existence before, and we will all continue to exist afterwards. So we are just this sort of midpoint. We're also in this way omnipotent. We'll know everything that we'll ever know. Different notion of omnipotence. And eternal. So again, we have all of these sorts of attributes of this sort of divine nature, and therefore our own knowledge is our knowledge of God, and that they're interrelated with one another, and that this becomes the sort of position that humanity is in. For this purpose, he continues, Socrates had the courage and self-collectedness to be sufficient unto himself, but in his relations to others, he also had the courage and self-collectedness to be merely an occasion, even for the most stupid person. Now, I want to highlight this word real quick, the occasion, because we've encountered it a few different times. The occasion here for the Socratic is you as the individual becoming the occasion to recollect truth, this self-knowledge that is God knowledge, and that every time that you encounter anybody, you are the occasion for them, even for the most stupid person. And so this is a different sort of idea of occasion. Now, this will be a term that will be reapplied in a different way in a moment, but this becomes the starting point of this thought project. He continues in page 12 to talk about this enthusiasm he has to learning the truth from this sort of Socratic position, which, oddly enough, you can't learn the truth, right? And this enthusiasm, he says, that it's beautiful, and that he might even wish it for everybody, this new sort of disposition to passion, which he does say Stoics would warn against, that this sort of enthusiasm might cause its own sort of problem. But even notions of Socratic self-denial is, in some ways, also a nothingness. But this also gets a little muddied along with everything else. That he learned, although, again, not really, these ideas from Socrates and Prodicus and others, and they have an interest in him because the truth in which I rest was in me and emerged from me. Again, you're not learning from these people because the truth was already in you. Therefore, you can't really learn. And so this is this interesting sort of idea. And not even Socrates would have been capable of giving it to me, no more than the coachman is capable of pulling the horse's load. Right? That Socrates might urge you on, but he can't give it to you, and therefore he can't really teach you anything, to go back to this earlier idea. Here, in the possession of the truth that I have from the beginning without knowing it, because you already have it, right? If you were to imagine yourself meeting Socrates or anybody else, there again, none of them would be more than an occasion. Right? This is the point, once again, that Socrates or anyone else, the maidservant or other philosophers, are only an occasion for you to learn. They are not teaching it to you. They are not the teachers. As Socrates expresses it by saying on the top of page 13, even in the underworld, he would only ask questions. For the ultimate idea of all questioning is that the person asked must himself possess the truth and acquire it by himself. The temporal part of departure is a nothing, because in the same moment I discover that I have known the truth from eternity without knowing it. In the same instant, that moment is hidden in the eternal. So again, you have all of this based out of eternal knowledge. This is the sort of beginning of this thought project, to look at things from a purely Socratic understanding of how we learn truth, and with that, notions of virtue. And we come to the conclusion again, as clearly spelled out, that you don't learn anything, you only recall. And Socrates and any other wise teacher isn't a teacher, but simply the occasion for you to encounter the truth and recollect it out of your own being. Now, Kierkegaard, Climacus, doesn't share the same worldview of pre-existence as Socrates. Or at least he's positing that if this isn't the case, what does this do? Right, in 13 here under the headline B, if the situation is to be different, then the moment in time must have such decisive significance that for no moment will I be able to forget it, neither in time nor in eternity, because the eternal, previously non-exist, came into existence in that moment. So we now have this different shift, right? So instead of everything having this eternal source, if things are coming into existence, then we have this shift, a non-exist becoming into an existence in this moment. With this presupposition, let us now examine the relations involved in this question. Once again, we'll return to this question. Can the truth be learned? So before we can address whether or not the truth can be learned, we need to look back once again at this preceding state where we start from. And he continues, we begin with the Socratic difficulty. How is one able to seek the truth, since it indeed equally impossible whether one has it or one does not? The Socratic line of thought, in effect, annulled this disjunction, right? For the Socratic view, there is no you either have the truth or you don't, because you already all have all the truth all the time because of this whole eternal knowledge. You're only recollecting the truth. You're only approaching virtue out of what is already in you. Since it appeared to be basically every human being possesses the truth. This is the Socratic understanding. That was his explanation. We have seen what resulted with regard to the moment. Now, if the moment is to acquire decisive significance, then the seeker up until that moment must not have possessed the truth, not even in the form of ignorance, for in that case the moment becomes merely the moment of occasion. Indeed, he must not even be a seeker. So again, we're starting to look at the same question of, can the truth be learned, by addressing things from a non-Socratic point of view. The dialogue, the sort of quasi-dialectic practice that's happening here between the Socratic point of view is now being compared against a non-Socratic point of view. Right? If we don't accept that we're eternal, have this eternal return, then we came into being. Then all of these other dominoes that fell so logically from the Socratic point of view have to be re-examined, and we have to look at it once again. So if from the Socratic point of view the truth was something that you possessed because of this identity, then now you don't possess it because that identity is not there. That's been forfeit. There becomes a new moment when you come into being. If before you sought after the truth because you're investigating yourself, then right now he's saying that you must not even be a seeker. This is the way that we have to state the difficulty. If we do not want to explain it Socratically, right, this is the difficulty. If we're not doing it Socratically, we have to do it non-Socratically. We have to do it differently. Consequently, he has to be defined as being outside of the truth, not coming to it like a proselyte, but going away from it, or as untruth. He is then untruth. From the Socratic position, you start off at this midpoint, right, where you are self-knowledge is God knowledge, etc. From a non-Socratic point of view, you don't possess the truth. It's something outside of you. And it needs to be something that is, at least to an extent, antagonistic to your nature, to your new being or understanding. And therefore you, all, what we would now call the learner, starts off in a position of being untruth. But, continue on at 13 and 14, how then is he to be reminded? Or what would be the use of reminding him of what he has not known and consequently cannot call to mind? I can't make you recall something that you don't possess because you don't possess it. Therefore, we have to approach the whole course of events differently. This brings us to now what's being addressed in section B here, the teacher. So not just the learner who would now be learning, but the teacher who would now be teaching. Again, to do this from a non-Socratic point of view, which is the point of this thought project, we need to change our position with this. If the teacher is to be the occasion that reminds the learner, he cannot assist him to recollect that he actually does know the truth, for the learner is indeed untruth. From the non-Socratic point of view, I can't simply help you recall what you already know, because you don't already know it if we're being non-Socratic. That for which the teacher can become the occasion of his recollecting is that he is untruth. But by this calling to mind, the learner is definitively excluded from the truth, even more than he was ignorant by being untruth. Right? You don't, without the aid of a teacher, have the ability to know the truth. You must have a teacher now, instead of it's impossible to have one. Consequently, in this way, precisely by reminding him, the teacher thrusts the learner away, except that by being turned in upon himself in this manner, the learner does not discover that he previously knew the truth, but discovers his untruth. If I was to ask you a question about something you don't know about, I'm not going to be encouraging you to recollect what you know, but rather what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be highlighting the fact that you don't know it. I'm going to make you feel possibly foolish as a result of this, or at least like you don't really know it, that it's alien to you. And as such, you're going to recognize yourself as untruth. To this act of consciousness, the Socratic principle applies. The teacher is only an occasion, whoever he may be, even if he is a god, because I can discover my own untruth only by myself, because only when I discover it is it discovered, not before. You have to discover it, otherwise it's not discoverable, even though the whole world might know it. Right? So again, we have this sort of distinction here between the Socratic and not. Now, if the learner too is to obtain the truth, the teacher must bring it to him. But not only that, along with it, he must provide him with a condition for understanding it. For the learner were himself the condition for understanding the truth. Then he merely needs to recollect. But the condition for understanding the truth is like being able to ask about it. The condition and the question contained the condition and the answer. So now I have to let you know that you're untruth as the teacher. I have to highlight that you have this gap in your knowledge, that you need to learn it, that you need to approach it. And the conditions for you to now learn have to be present in that if I'm going to teach it for you. From the Socratic point of view, you already had the condition to know the truth because you already possessed it. From the non-Socratic, this has to be delivered from the outside. But the one who not only gives the learner the truth, but provides the condition is not a teacher. Ultimately, all instruction depends upon the presence of the condition. Right? You have to have the condition to be able to accept the truth, is what's being postulated here. If it is lacking, then a teacher is capable of nothing, because in the second case, the teacher, before beginning to teach, must transform, not reform, the learner. So before you can even learn, you have to know that you need to learn, and that you have this gap in your knowledge. You must have this condition first. This is the starting point. But no human being is capable of doing this. This is the difficulty. If it is to take place, it must be done by the God himself, is what Johannes Climacus is arguing here at the top of 15. Now, inasmuch as the learner exists, he is indeed created, and accordingly, God must have given him the condition for understanding the truth. Right? That it might be something that's a part of our human nature, a part of this notion of what it is to be human, is this rationality, that it has to be introduced here kind of at creation. For otherwise, you previously would be merely an animal, and the teacher who gave you the condition along with the truth would make him a human being for the first time, right? And so no one's saying that only upon learning are you now a human, right? You must have always had this as a possibility. But insofar as the moment is to have decisive significance, and if that is not assumed, then in fact we have to remain with the Socratic, he must lack the condition, consequently be deprived of it. So you must have the condition as a part of your nature, but you shouldn't have it as something that you have control over. It needs to be something that is then reintroduced also by the teacher to remain unsocratic or non-Socratic, and therefore we have to have some sort of break from this earlier condition that it's not simply rationality. So we have to somehow forfeit this condition. And he says that this cannot have been due to the act of the God, for this would be a contradiction, or to an incident, for if it was a contradiction, that something inferior would be able to vanquish something superior, right? So it can't simply be an accident. It must therefore be due to himself. If he could have lost the condition in such a way that it was not due to himself, and if he could be in the state of loss without it being due to himself, then he would have possessed the condition only accidentally, which is a contradiction, since the condition for the truth is an essential condition. So this is the sort of debate that we're finding in ourselves, that we have to find some sort of way that you are responsible for the condition, that this is something you possess, but it's also something that you, at least in part, have forfeited, and you're responsible for this forfeiture. The untruth, then, is not merely outside the truth, but is polemical against the truth, which is expressed by saying that he himself has forfeited and is forfeiting this condition. Right? You have to have a different attitude that rejects the notion of the truth. This must be your new standpoint, where you might have had the condition, you've rejected this condition, you've forfeited this condition, and you've lost it. This, about 2/3 of the way down on page 15. The teacher, then, is the God himself, who, acting as the occasion, prompts the learner to be reminded that he is untruth, and is that through his own fault that you forfeited the condition. But this state to be untruth, and for that to be of one's own fault, what shall we call it? Well, the name of this sort of forfeited condition, where it's your own fault, how shall we identify it? What is the name? Let us call it sin. So this now becomes the nature or identity from this non-Socratic philosophical perspective of what sin is for Johannes Climacus in this thought project. In many ways, he's using these terms because they're familiar, but he's giving them new perspective and identity. So it's not simply sin from a theological perspective. He's trying to approach this entirely from notions of a philosophical standpoint and not from some other beginning point. The teacher then is the God who gives the condition and gives the truth. Now, what shall we call such a teacher? For we surely do agree that we have gone beyond the definition of a teacher. Your standard teacher is not capable of doing all of this. So for you to actually learn, we must have some sort of super teacher to be able to do this, since it is in fact the God. This is the way that it works. Inasmuch as the learner is untruth, but is that by his own act, and accordingly he's already said that there's no other way that it can be. He might seem to be free, for to be on one's own certainly is freedom, and yet he is indeed unfree, bound and excluded, because he is to be free from the truth is indeed to be excluded, and to be excluded by oneself is indeed to be bound. Now notice here we're getting into this notion of free will. You're free, but you're also bound by your ignorance. You're bound by being untruth. You're free to make the decision to reject it, but this freedom now comes with notions of new captivity. And it might be an interesting idea to compare this notion of free will to that of Augustine and his arguments about what free will is in those extra readings, or something else along those lines. Boethius later in his notions of free will and how all of this works would have a similar but yet different notions. St. Irenaeus and other readings also addresses this issue, and on and on and on. But here we're starting to get the notion of free will that's attached to it for Climacus. End of 15, beginning of 16. But since he is bound by himself, he cannot work himself loose or free himself. For that which he binds me should also be able to set me free at will. And since that is himself, he should certainly be able to do it. But first of all, he must will it. But just suppose that he is very profoundly reminded that for which the teacher became the occasion, and this must never be forgotten, of his recollecting. Just suppose that he willed it. In that case, if by the willing it he could do it by himself, his having been bound would have become a bygone state, one that in the moment of liberation would vanish without a trace, and the moment would not gain decisive significance. He would be unaware that he had bound himself and had now set himself free. So this has to have some weight to it. We can't simply be bound and then unbind ourselves just as easily, because otherwise the moment this transformation from untruth to truth would not have decisive significance. Therefore, it has to be something bigger, something that once you bind yourself, you need the assistance of the other to unbind yourself from it. Here he has a footnote, and we'll just kind of catch that on for a moment. It says, we shall take our time. After all, there is no need to hurry. By going slowly, one sometimes does indeed fail to reach the goal, but by going too fast, one sometimes passes it. We shall discuss this somewhat in Greek fashion. If a child who has received the gift of a little money, enough to be able to buy either a good book, for example, or one toy, for both cost the same, buys the toy, can he use the same money to buy the book? By no means, right? He should have already been able to answer that. If you have only a certain amount of money and you spent it on one item instead of the other, you don't have that money to now buy that other item, right? For now the money has been spent. But he may go to the bookseller and ask him if he will exchange the book for the toy. Suppose the bookseller answers, my dear child, your toy is worthless. It is certainly true that when you still had the money that you could have bought the book just as well as the toy. But the awkward thing about the toy is that once you have purchased it, it has lost all value. Would not the child think, this is very strange indeed? And so it was also once, that when man could buy freedom and unfreedom for the same price, and this price was the free choice of the soul and the surrender of the choice, he chose unfreedom. But if he then were to approach the god and ask whether he could make an exchange, the answer presumably would be, undeniably, there was a time when you could have bought what you wanted. But the curious thing about unfreedom is that it is once purchased, it has no value whatsoever, even though one pays the same price for it. I wonder if a person would say, this is very strange indeed. Or if two hostile armies faced each other, there came a knight from both sides invited to join, but he chose the one side, was defeated and taken prisoner. As prisoner, he was brought before the conqueror and was foolish enough to offer him services on the conditions originally offered. I wonder if the conqueror would not say to him, my dear fellow, you are my prisoner now. True enough, at one time you could have chosen differently, but now everything is changed. Would this not be strange indeed, if it was otherwise? If the moment did not have this decisive significance, then the child, after all, must indeed have bought the book and merely have been ignorant of it, mistakenly thinking that he had bought the toy. The prisoner, after all, must have fought for the other side, but had not seen, because of the fog, that he really sided with the one whose prisoner was now imagined himself to be. Right, so again, this is the sort of idea that you've chosen by the learner with the nature of untruth. And this choice has the weight that it's now worthless. You're free. You were free to make a choice, but now that choice, that commodity, that value has been spent and has been lost. Page 17, second paragraph down. What then should we call such a teacher who gives him the condition? Again, and along with the truth, let us call him a savior, again borrowing from this theological language, for he does indeed save the learner from unfreedom, saves him from himself. Let us call him a deliverer, for he does indeed deliver the person who had imprisoned himself. And no one is so dreadfully imprisoned and kept in captivity is so impossible to break out as that in which the individual holds himself captive. Right? When you're holding yourself captive, this is the worst form of captivity. And yet, even this does not say enough. For by his unfreedom, he had indeed become guilty of something. And if that teacher gives him the condition and the truth, he is, of course, a reconciler who takes away the wrath that lay over this notions of incurred guilt. So we have all of these different theological titles attached in with what it is to be this actual teacher in relation to this learner. Kierkegaard continues at the end of 17, beginning of 18, by saying that this teacher, what sort of teacher is this? The learner will never be able to forget this, because the moment he says he would sink down into himself as somebody who once possessed this condition and then rejected it, right? You'd end up identifying your weakness and, again, in some ways almost reintroducing or doubling down on this notion of guilt at rejecting this truth. Beginning of 18, he says, "But a teacher such as that, what shall we call him?" A teacher certainly can evaluate the learner with respect to whether or not he is making progress, but he cannot pass judgment on him, for he must be Socratic enough to perceive that he cannot give the learner what is essential. The teacher, then, is actually not a teacher, but a judge. Right? They have to judge this condition and judge the individual, or at least the individual is judging themselves now, having received the condition from the teacher. Even when the learner has more fully put on the condition, and then, by doing so, has become immersed in the truth, he still can never forget that the teacher, or allow him to disappear Socratically, which still is far more profound than all unseasonable and sorts of notions of fanaticism. Indeed, it is the highest of all that, other than it is not the truth. Right? So this is the only way that it can be the truth, is through understanding this. And now a moment such as this is unique. To be sure, it is short and temporal, as the moment is. It is passing, as the moment is. Past, as the moment is the next moment. And yet it is decisive, and yet it is filled with the eternal. A moment such as this must have a special name. Let us call it the fullness of time. Right? This is another way of understanding the moment, because this moment is going to be the pinnacle of moments as it changes one from one nature into another. It's transitory. It disappears as a moment, but it's also transformative. So it's significant. This now brings us to section C, the follower. When the learner is untruth, and otherwise we go back to the Socratic, but is nevertheless a human being, and he now receives the condition and the truth, he does not, of course, become a human being for the first time, for he already was that, but he becomes a different person, not in the jesting sense, as if he became someone else of the same quality as before, but he becomes a person of a different quality, or as we also call it, a new person. Right? So you have this new sort of identity as a follower, the difference of quality, much as if somebody then swears an oath and joins the military. You're now a members of the armed forces instead of a civilian, right? There's a different quality based upon your service or this event, this moment, this change. And as much as he was untruth, he was continually in the process of departing from the truth. As a result of receiving the condition in the moment, his course took the opposite direction, or he was turned around. Let us call this change conversion, even though this is a word hitherto unused, but we choose it precisely in order to avoid confusion, for it seems as it was created for the very change of which we are speaking. So again, we can talk about this notion of conversion being a change. If we go over to 19, the first full paragraph down, inasmuch as he was untruth, and now, along with the condition, receives the truth, a change takes place in him, like the change from not to be to be. But this transition from not to be to be is indeed a transition of birth. But the person who already is cannot be born, and yet he is born. Let us call this transition rebirth, by which he enters the world a second time, just as birth, but the individual human being who is yet knows nothing about the world into which he was born, whether it is inhabited, whether there are other human beings from it, for presumably we can be baptized en masse, but we can never forget be reborn en masse. Just as the person who, by Socratic midwifery, gives birth to himself, and in so doing forgot everything else in the world, and in a much more profound sense owed no human being anything, so also the one who is born again owes no human being anything, but owes that divine teacher everything. Now, we can call this sort of notions wrapped up in that interlude there between with notions of repentance, but what we're really seeing here is this idea of this change from not to be to be. Is this continual change for Kierkegaard, and we see some of his notions of existentialism here, where you're getting an identity, your existence and essence are lined up, and your existence now transforms along with this new essence, this new identity there, right? That the existence might continue on, but it has this sort of transition nature. And this is by your choosing, and therefore your choices have severe value and importance in telling you who and what you are. Continuing on page 20, but is what has been elaborated here thinkable? We shall not be in a hurry with the answer, for someone who has become prolonged pondering never comes up with an answer, is not only the one who fails to answer, so too one who admitted manifests of marvelously quickness in answering, but not the desirable slowness in considering the difficulty before explaining it. Before we answer, we shall ask who ought to answer the question. A fairly, interesting idea. This matter of being born, is it thinkable? Well, why not? But who's supposed to think it? One who is born or one who is not born? The later, of course, is unreasonable and cannot occur to anyone, for this notion certainly cannot occur to one who is born. When one who is born thinks of himself as born, he of course is thinking of the transition from not to be to be. This situation must be the same with rebirth. That, again, this sort of qualitative change in your nature, in the ontology of man. Or is the matter made more difficult by this? That the non-being precedes the rebirth has more being than the non-being that precedes birth. But who then is supposed to think this? It must of course be one who is reborn, for it would be unreasonable to think that one who is not reborn should do it, and would it not be ludicrous if he were to occur to one who is not reborn? He concludes here, beginning on the other side of this whole, is this unthinkable, by saying if a person originally possesses the condition to understand the truth, he thinks that since he himself is, God is. If he is in untruth, then he must of course think this about himself, and recollection will be unable to help him to think anything but this. Whether or not he is to go any further, the moment must decide. But once again, we get this notion of the moment that's going to decide and impact things. Although it already was active in making him perceive that he is indeed untruth. If he does not understand this, then he is to be referred to Socrates, even though his opinion that he has gone much further will cause that wise man to a great deal of trouble, as did those who became so exasperated with him when he took away some foolish notion from them that they positively wanted to bite him. In Thetius, right? Top of 21. In the moment, a person becomes aware that he was born, for his previous state to which he is not to appeal was indeed of one of not to be. In the moment, he becomes aware of the rebirth, for his previous state was indeed of not to be. If his previous state would have been one of to be, then under no circumstances would the moment have acquired decisive significance for him, as explained above. Whereas the Greek pathos focused on recollection, the pathos of our project focuses on the moment, and no wonder, for it is not exceedingly pathos-filled matter to come into existence from the state of not to be. And this is the interesting sort of twist that we're having here, that it's moving from not to be, that this is part of the significance of the moment, is that it is this transitory nature. This is indeed my project, he says, as you see. But perhaps someone will say, this is the most ludicrous of all projects, or rather, you are the most ludicrous of all project cranks. Interesting. For even if someone comes up with a foolish scheme, there is always at least the truth that he is the one who came up with the scheme. But you, on the other hand, are behaving like a vagabond who charges a fee for showing an area that everyone can see. You are like the man who in the afternoon exhibited for a fee a ram that in the forenoon anyone could see free of charge, grazing on that open pasture. Maybe so, I hide my face in shame. But supposing that I am that ludicrous, then let me put things right again with a new project. Admittingly, gunpowder was invented centuries ago, so it would be ludicrous for me to pretend that I invented it. But would it also be ludicrous for me to assume that someone had invented it? Now I'm going to be so courteous as to assume that you are the one who has invented my project. More courtesy than you could not expect. Or if you deny this, will you then also deny that someone has invented it? That is, some human being. In that case, I am just as close to having invented it as any other person. Therefore, you are not angry with me because falsely I attribute to myself something that belongs to another human being, but you are angry with me because I falsely attribute to myself something that belongs to no human being. And you are just as angry when I want to attribute that invention to you. Is it not curious that something like this exists, about which everyone who knows it also knows that he has not invented it, and that this go to the next house does not halt and cannot be halted, even though one were to go on to everybody? Yet this oddity enthralls me exceedingly, for it tests the correctness of the hypothesis and demonstrates it. It would indeed be unreasonable to require a person to find out all by himself that he does not exist. But this transition is precisely the transition of rebirth from not existing to existing. There's this interesting notion here with the gunpowder, right? We all know that gunpowder exists, that somebody invented it. If I was to say you invented it, of course you would say, this is a false claim. How dare you say that? If I was to say I did, you're also going to say that it's a false claim. How dare I say that? So we have to find this sort of interesting idea of I'm as close and you're as close to being invented in that we know that it was invented by somebody. And at this point, it was almost invented by nobody. And what value does that have? That our proximity to the correctness doesn't itself alleviate the idea that we're going to arrive at this conclusion. We're all equally close to having invented it, yet none of us actually invented it. Whether he understands it later certainly makes no difference, concluding on the end of 22. For simply because someone knows how to use gunpowder knows how to analyze it into its components, does not mean that he invented it. So go ahead and be angry with me and with any other human being who pretends to have invented it. But you do not, for that reason, need to be angry with the idea. And so here we're also seeing this sort of separation between claims of the truth and questions about claims of the truth. And this is kind of the division that he's wanting to say, that you might want to say, okay, what are you doing here? What's your schema? But he's going to say, we're just trying to approach this as an intellectual question and starting point. And this is where we're trying to go with this work. So we've introduced some basic terms and ideas here. We have the follower, we have the teacher, we have the truth, we have untruth, we have Socratic, and we have non-Socratic. We have the moment, which takes on decisive significance, where we change from not to be, and other terms for this transition, such as rebirth, and all of these other ideas are wrapped up into it. So we're already kind of beginning this idea, but we need to analyze this again from a slightly different perspective, which is what we're going to be doing with chapter 2 and 3 and so on, where we're kind of approaching this same sort of idea of how can the truth be learned? What is the sort of thought project that's going to be wrapped up with the idea of just learning? If indeed we are not going to take Socrates and what we addressed in Meno to indeed be the case.